What's up, Business Gators? Hey, it's Thanksgiving. You wanted some time off? Here is your video on how you can motivate your sales force. This is going to include sales force compensation, but before we get into compensating the sales force, we have to go into what is actually going to be involved with getting them to do what you want them to do. And that's essentially what compensation is. It's a form of motivation. I want to start with this myth right here. All salespeople are money motivated. And this is actually going to start the foundation of the second part of what we're going to talk about. So we will go over some basic theories and ideas when it comes to compensation in terms of strategy, but we're going to talk about other types of motivation beyond the compensation portion. So when it comes to managing and motivating your sales force, there's two areas that authors of various Salesforce compensation literature talk about. One gets into the leadership and how are you leading, how are you communicating, how are you motivating basically beyond actual motivation. And the second is basically how are you measuring someone. In order to compensate people, especially when you're talking about a sales force, you have to measure whether or not they're effective. Actually, this is true in almost any job that you have, but it's really important when it comes to how you're going to actually compensate someone in a sales force. Beyond that, it's incentivizing properly and then striking a balance between the two of them. So what we want to do is we just want to start with the firm strategy, the business's strategy, and then move and see how it's going to actually create results. How that design is essentially going to ensure that you're having success with your sales force. Remember, it's your responsibility to empower your sales force. So the first piece of this is really proper job design, proper salesperson design, if you will. It has to align to your buyers, you have to give clarity of purpose, and it needs to be aligned completely to the sales tasks that are going on. Remember, different types of customers, different types of tasks exist for each different type of job and salesperson that you happen to have. So, for example, your order takers, your funnel starters, if you will, the top of the funnel salesperson, the call getters you will sometimes hear about. All of those are different than the closers, than the key account managers, and the tasks involved are very, very different. Anyone who's working field sales, especially our friends at Dexian, probably is going out and meeting, usually going to lunch. Well, there's a lot of different things that go into that versus someone who's inside sales position. Next, we want to talk about the rewards. The rewards have to also be appropriate to the sales task. If you have a situation, for example, say a Hershey's or an M&M Mars rep who's putting candy on the shelves, well, they're not there to actually stimulate that demand. Well, they have a different pay mix, we'll talk about that in a little bit, than someone who's directly selling and who can actually affect the close. Though that proper incentivization is important to make sure that people are doing what you need them to do. So when we look at something such as what happened at Wells Fargo, you can see that the culture was really the foundation for the problem at Wells Fargo, not necessarily the compensation itself. Of course, we also look at the quotas that they had put in, and the quotas being too high also contributed to that. It wasn't the compensation itself, it was other aspects around that compensation. When you're dealing with your sales force, it's also important to make sure that you have the proper measures. You've probably heard of SMART before, and that simply means specific and measurable. If it's not specific and measurable, it gets very difficult to review success, and sometimes problematic. Of course, they need to be achievable and reasonable. If they're not achievable, if they're not reasonable, you're either going to lose your sales force or you're going to create a culture that has very aggressive behavior. Naturally, time-bound. How often are you going to review your salespeople? Continuing along this line, we also need to make sure that you have the right customers and the right products. And importantly, that the customers that are aligned again to the particular salesperson are also aligned to the products. The products need to make sense for the customers. And of course, the customers need to be something that your salesperson is going to be able to do. Remember, different salespeople at different points in their career are going to be able to handle different types of customers, whether you're talking key account, whether you're talking C-suite or any others. And finally, leadership needs to lead. We talked in class a lot about how leadership can really make or break an organization. Again, you saw that with Wells Fargo. The leadership was poor. The leadership all the way from the top down to those middle managers was creating a toxic culture. So when you're looking at your sales force, how is leadership potentially contributing or causing problems with the performance that you're looking for? Leadership needs to make sure that it is communicating. If leadership doesn't communicate well, you've got a problem. Leadership should also encourage proper communication. Remember the story about Ben, who in his C-suite meetings would tear into anyone who had even slightly bad news. That doesn't encourage communication, and it actually could have caused some problems. The leadership needs to be regular and fair. No favoritism based on performance, basically. That can be a problem, especially when favoritism allows some people to get away with things that they shouldn't and others to not. Leadership also needs to make sure that it is stimulating the market. And what does this mean? Well, if you're in sales, and especially at a larger company, what is the company doing to make sure that people are aware of your products and service? Are they doing advertising? Are they out there networking? Look at that and look at how you can make sure that your salespeople, when they're making cold calls, aren't making frigid cold calls. That was corny. It works though. Also, what are you doing to help your salespeople? Sales enablement is this idea of ensuring that your salespeople are enabled. CRM systems are a form of sales enablement. Continual training is a form of sales enablement. Anything that you do to really ease the job of your salespeople is important to ensuring that you're getting the results that you need as a company. Leadership is responsible for ensuring that everything is aligning properly. Think about one of your joints. If it's not in alignment, the bones are grinding against each other, or something in your car, two pieces of metal grinding against each other, eventually that creates friction and problems, if not injury. The metaphor works for a business as well. Make sure as a leader that you're doing what you can to reduce friction, to reduce problems, and reduce toxicity. And as a leader, you're creating a culture. Hopefully it is a positive culture that leads to results. And we're going to talk about how motivation factors into that. So, some questions, thoughts, and comments for you. How might a misalignment between the salesperson and the following areas cause some problems? What if the salesperson is misaligned with the products? What if the products are misaligned with the customers? Again, think about some situations where the salesperson might be misaligned with a customer and might not have the right tasks. Think about that through some of the stuff that you might have done in your life or where you may be going. Think about some of the speakers that we've had in class. How would you discuss how not stimulating the market could cause problems in a sales force? And the final thing on here for you to consider, though I would have you consider many more questions that might come from some of these lectures, is why must there be that balance between leadership and communication and culture building and the actual incentivization? We will return to that question later on with some of the compensation conversations in the lecture. Next up, we are going to talk about motivation, including internal and external motivation. Be sure to take a break between this section and the next. Salesforce compensation is only one type of motivator that you're going to use to ensure that your salespeople are delivering the results. Compensation, and I'm talking money, is only one factor when it comes to motivating your team and your salespeople to ensure that you're building the results that you need to for your business. In this next segment, we're going to talk about motivation and how it matters beyond just your simple financial compensation. The first vector that I want to look at when it comes to your motivators are whether they're internal or they're external. You've probably heard these terms before, intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. Well, that's what this means. And it really just talks about whether the motivation is within you or the motivation's coming from outside of you. Example of an internal or intrinsic motivator might be the drive to do better for customers. External is compensation, is money. The next area that to think about is whether the motivation is positive or negative. Let's think about this when you might be training your puppy at home. Positive motivation is when you'd give your puppy a treat when the dog goes outside and does their business where it's supposed to. Negative would be the stereotypical using the newspaper to swat the puppy's nose if they happen to have done so inside. It's important to understand that not all negative motivators are bad, but you've got to be careful because they do burn people out. I'll mention that again as we get into it. Chow put out something called Octalysis, which is part of gamification. Octalysis basically looks at these 8 types of motivations. And what Chow has done is he separated them into external and internal, and positive and negative. He uses the term black hat and white hat, but I think positive and negative really sums it up much better. So, splitting these in half, on the right we have intrinsic motivators, and on the left we have extrinsic motivators. And of course, looking at it from top to bottom, on the top we've got positive reinforcements, and on the bottom, negative reinforcements. Now keep in mind, some of this is a bit like a continuum. Essentially, that gives us 4 quadrants of motivations. You could have positive extrinsic motivators, positive intrinsic motivators, negative intrinsic motivators, and of course, negative extrinsic motivators. We're going to talk about each one of these, how it relates to a sales force. Next, we're going to talk about how each of these can relate to motivating your sales force. We're going to start with the first driver that Chow puts out, and that is epic meaning and calling. This is essentially when anyone is engaged in something that is greater than themselves. Many of you may have something that's real important to you when it comes to doing social initiatives. That might be why you chose a specific charity when it came to the business development project. For example, if you're into kids and you like helping kids, well, then Food for Kids may have been the one that you decided to go with. Alternatively, some people really like animals and making sure that animals are taken care of, and that's where the Humane Society or Carson Springs comes into play. For a company to ensure that anyone who has this meaning as part of their motivator needs to make sure that they have some sort of visionary company goals. Think about Apple's goal of empowering humanity from the 90s when Steve Jobs took over. That's something that would really motivate people to do more, especially with less. You can also focus on benefiting customers. Hopefully, you're hiring people who are focused on customers as well. And so that can be an intrinsic motivator in and of itself. Another way is to look at your entire company and what are you doing to allow people to give back to social causes that they like. Perhaps, for example, if an employee is into the environment, for every sale they make, you plant a tree. Or for every sale you make, they donate food to a country that's not doing so well. This is great because it's powerful, but it is easy to procrastinate on for even the most intrinsically motivated person. It can be tough to stimulate immediately. And of course, that's why we have the Octalysis, which helps us look at how we can create a balance among the 8 drivers. The next, on the extrinsic side of things, is development and accomplishment. So this is basically how you might engage in growth and development of your people. If you're someone who's stimulated and motivated intrinsically by growth and development, you probably read a lot. In video games, you might enjoy every time you level up. So things that you can do. One is you can create a progression ladder where you're helping an employee or a salesperson rise to new levels in that particular sales force. It may not necessarily be attached to a promotion. Promotion might be a big accomplishment, but even within that, how are you rewarding just some of the little KPIs that go into a day-to-day job of a salesperson? Equally so, and somewhat related to that is, are you doing something to recognize various milestones? Did someone just finish their training? How do you recognize that? Some companies will allow people to bang a gong every time that there's a sale. That's part of this. The other thing you can do is you can create other types of incentivizations and bonuses with various skill builders that you might have. Perhaps you want to recognize people who are reading sales books on the off time. And of course, many sales organizations will use leaderboards. The New York Mets, for example, has leaderboards everywhere showing who's leading, who's selling how much, and so forth. The same thing with KnowBe4 and many of the other floors that I've visited. In fact, I don't think I've ever seen a sales floor without some form of a leaderboard. Core driver number 3 is the empowerment of creativity and feedback. And so this is like a play motivator. This is where people get to do things. Google uses this by allowing employees to do various things that might not directly be related to work. That's actually where the Google Doodle came from. It's a little harder to do in a Salesforce, but what are you doing to allow customization of career paths and encouraging free thinking? If an employee wants to do some sort of project, let them do that project. That would allow them to feel empowered to create things at that particular job. Again, this might be a little difficult to conceive of when it comes to a Salesforce, but it is possible.
Money, money, money.
Ownership and possession is basically where the financial component of your Salesforce compensation and the motivator behind it comes in. This isn't just ownership of money, though. It could be the ownership of the job. Remember that there are other things beyond money that can create that ownership as well. If, for example, one of your biggest prizes is a car, well, that might create some sort of extrinsic motivation on the side. Again, be careful with this because done wrong, this can create that toxic culture. The next, social influence and relatedness. We are social creatures. It's important to understand how that factors in whether we're at work or whether we're at play on a weekend. This is basically a desire to connect. Team competitions are great ways to do that because one, you're engaging with that development and that desire to get something, but at the same time, the people on the same team are going to be competing together. Remember the scavenger hunt? Well, that was me looking to create some sort of connection so that you can continue to motivate yourselves throughout the semester. Having mentorship as well as peer recognition is another way of creating these social connections. Happy hours?
You know what we haven't done in a while? Happy hour.
Leadership retreats, bonding events, those also allow you to create social connection that motivates people to work with each other. Just make sure that you make it genuine. Now we're starting to get into some of the more negative motivators. Scarcity and impatience are one of those, although it does get used very well in certain sales forces. This is basically built into that primal part of us that if something is not in high supply, we're going to want it more. Think supply and demand. Contests like President's Club, where only the top 10% get in, or anything where you might see a regional or a territory leader actually makes use of this, in addition to some of the other motivators that we've talked about here. Anything with a limited time incentive as well, so spiffs, can also work on scarcity. When it comes to scarcity and when it comes to things like President's Club, you have to make sure that you strike the right balance between challenge and skill level. This researcher, whose name I can't pronounce, created this sweet spot by looking at that. Essentially, if it's too challenging, you're going to create a lot of anxiety. Similarly, if it's not challenging enough, you're going to create boredom. So what is the right balance between that challenge and skill set? And you notice the more skill that you have, the more challenge is necessary, but you have to build up to it. This is also important when you think about leveling up from one of the other motivators. This unpredictability motivator is basically that sometimes we enjoy a happy surprise. So, what kind of random acts of recognition might you put through? What type of mystery incentives exist or surprise bonuses? Again, be careful with this. Go back to the first video. You want to make sure that everything is fair when it comes to what you're doing. So make sure that your surprises aren't too negative, and make sure that you're not unfairly, even if accidentally, incentivizing the same person over and over. Finally, we generally like to avoid bad things. So loss and avoidance is another motivator. Of course, losing your job or getting demoted is a type of negative motivation. That's where we have things like PIPs or performance improvement programs to help improve someone who doesn't want to lose their job. No one should fear the loss of their job without some sort of warning, but at the same time, if someone doesn't meet quota for several quarters or years, that can be a problem. And you want to focus on making sure that there's some negative incentive to not meeting your basic KPIs. Again, done wrong, this can produce some really bad outcomes. So be careful. Now, I know I said that there was 8, but there is a 9th motivator that is not part of the octalysis, and that's sensory motivation. This might be something that's hedonic in nature. So if there's a certain decadent dessert that you like, this is a sensory motivator. Some places might have vacations or other office perks like candy or soda or free lunches that could be a part of that. Again, not exactly one of the core drivers, but something that every now and then you might be able to take advantage of. Now, when it comes to motivation, intrinsic and extrinsic, it's important to put some cautions out there. First is the over-justification effect. So essentially, this is where those extrinsic rewards can undermine intrinsic motivation. Let me give you a great example of this. I used to love playing basketball. I was horrible at it, but there's just something about tossing the ball into the hoop that I enjoyed when I was a kid. Now, unfortunately for me, my high school was a huge basketball school. Now, I'm 5'0", so I am not good at playing basketball. Well, I was forced to do it over and over and graded poorly because of my inability to play well. As a result, I lost all motivation to ever play basketball again. In fact, to this day, I don't even like it, and I barely know the rules of the game whenever I go to one. If I do go, though, it's more for the social interaction as opposed to the game itself. Another example might be if any of you really enjoy reading. Well, once you're forced to read for school, sometimes it takes away that intrinsic love of reading, whether it's fiction or whether it's nonfiction. And finally, some people really enjoy jogging or running, but when it becomes competitive and they're going after, say, prizes, well, that can sometimes cause a loss of the love of whatever that person happened to be doing. Can that happen as well with a sales force? Absolutely. And that's where you've got to be careful with extrinsic motivators when it comes to people who naturally have an intrinsic motivation. That is not the only intrinsic killer, of course. There's a ton of things here that could damage your ability to really motivate someone intrinsically. Intrinsic motivators are much more powerful, but they do have a fragility to them. So you have to make sure you're taking care not to overdo it. Now, some thoughts, questions, and comments. First, where have you seen aspects of these different motivators in your jobs, clubs, home, or even school? Besides, in a sales force, where might you be able to take advantage of some of these areas? And finally, can you name any of the areas where it might not have gone well? Maybe the best of intentions, but it flubbed, or it went too far. Again, this could be school, this could be your clubs, even some of your jobs. Take care to think of those, but be sure to take a break before we get into the next part, which is managing using DISC. Now let's think about how you might use a DISC assessment to work with your particular salespeople. For this, I want to go beyond this type of DISC representation that you may have seen in MAR 3400. For my business, whether I'm executive coaching or working with my salespeople, I actually work with something called DISC 2.0. So in DISC 2.0, we've got this quadrant-based approach. Importantly, we've got the two axes, fast-paced or moderately paced in terms of how fast someone acts, and whether someone's skeptical or accepting, usually of ideas. DISC 2.0 does use a little bit more higher resolution. It takes each of those quadrants and breaks them into 3. And those 3 represent 12 different types of individuals that break up into 8 scales. Now, let's take a look at each of these 8 scales one at a time. This can apply to you as a manager or your salespeople as well, and each have their strengths and weaknesses. As a leader, it's important for you to understand what those strengths and weaknesses may be and understand what those strengths and weaknesses might manifest in a salesperson. Our first here is the D, which of course is the dominant area. That is actually where my particular PIP is for this. This, you're looking at someone who's bold, forceful, and may actually be a bit blunt. As a leader, you might want to tone that down a little bit. Next is the DI or ID, which is at the top of this. This is characterized by fast action, oftentimes, pretty bold, might want to try new things. A solid I, interactive, is someone who's going to be extremely sociable. If we want to think about the big 5, this person is probably very extroverted. As it says on the screen here, the SI type is going to be very upbeat, empathetic, and positive. The SI may also be fairly supporting as well, in addition to the S. The S, being calm and accommodating, also doesn't want to upset the apple cart too much. Your S's may be a little conflict averse at the same time. As we get a little lower into the grid and we get to that moderately paced person, we now can see your SC or CS. Down here at the bottom in the most moderately paced area is probably going to be fairly passive and calm, not very quick to act. They're probably going to make a great listener. They may also be fairly soft-spoken. As we move into the C, now we've got the cautious type. In the DISC vernacular, this is actually represented by the word conscientious, but not in the same way that most people will think of conscientious. The C is going to be private and analytical. If you've got a C person, they may be a little slow to act and they may want to put all the facts together. Similarly, if you have a C buyer, you're going to need to have a lot of information for them. C leaders can sometimes require a lot of information before actually acting. Remember, we're on the moderately paced side of things. As we get to the final one, the DC, now we're in the skeptic area, but we're still now into that D. They could be a little impatient, especially when it comes to incompetence, and of course, embody all of the aspects of that D and C all in one. So, where do you think you might be on this list? Where do you think some of your salespeople might be? Let's talk about that. Here, I have 2 leaders and 1 salesperson. The leader on the left is a DI, and what you're looking at is you're looking at a DISC 2.0 profile. They're not all the way on the rim of the D or the DI, so they're still a little slower paced. Those of you who are wondering, what are those top graphs? That's what we call an umbrella graph. And that shows where this person may stretch into the S or the C aspects of things. This particular DI is probably going to be very quick to act, though. The right leader is a solid I. Again, not completely on the outside. The person on the right had just moved into a leadership role. And as such, you can see how he's starting to gain some aspects of the DC. As an executive coach to this individual, I had to show how their new leadership role has started to cause them to answer some of the questions of the DISC survey, such that some of that cautiousness is coming out. And that's where the D dominant aspect of their personality is going to start coming into play. On the right is a salesperson that unfortunately didn't work. This is actually more my problem than anything else. This salesperson was a strong S and not very quick to move. And in fact, their desire to not have any feelings hurt or anything along those lines was part of the problem. I needed to learn how to train this salesperson to be a little bit less like an S and more like an I and a D. Now, their particular graph shows that they do stretch into that area of the I. And what we see around the circle is priorities for someone who's in a sales role. That also would apply to a buyer in that role as well. This is my profile. Now, it is important to note that from 2020 through 2023, when I actually took this, I probably was more of a DI, like the manager that I showed you before. That wasn't actually me. However, recent events moved me from this type of position over to this where I am a solid D and I'm moving closer to the edge of that. And as a leader, these are my priorities. I like action. I do stretch into that area because enthusiasm is important to me, but I still need results and I still will challenge, and I do enjoy a challenge as well. As a leader, I have to take this into account when I'm working with my particular salespeople or a sales manager or even students. So let's go back to this original DISC profile that I brought up before. Best guess in terms of interpreting this linear DISC profile into the DISC 2.0 is that I would probably put this person in the middle of an I, but they do stretch pretty well into dominant, but more so into the S category. And we can see a little bit of that C. I'm not the best at representing the DISC 2.0 graphic, but imagine this using the other graphs. So, some questions, thoughts, and comments when it comes to the DISC and managing with DISC. First, where would your dot be? Now, this 2.0 profile is a little expensive to take. It costs about $100 to $150. But if you've taken a DISC profile with Dr. Tufts in MAR 3400, you might be able to interpret where you would sit on this particular scale. How could you, as a leader, work with any of those particular 8 archetypes? Have you been a leader in a class project or a student organization or even at work where you had to work with one of these different archetypes? How could this help you understand any conflict that you may have had or any synergies that you might have had? And finally, equally important, how could you manage up? If you're a D and your supervisor is an S, how could you use that to avoid conflict? If you're a D and you're working for an I, then any ideas you have might be for the betterment of the people on your team. As opposed to if you happen to be an I and you want to present something to a D, you may want to be results-oriented. Think about this in your positions over the next couple of years and how you can use DISC to understand and manage up. That way, it'll make it easier for you to manage down. We're going to talk about Salesforce compensation next, but as always, make sure you take a little bit of a break. Now finally, let's talk actual compensation of your Salesforce. This is where you're going to put a lot of important scientific time thinking about how you're going to make sure that you are fairly compensating your sales force in a way that makes sense for the firm. It's important to note, as much as there's all of these intrinsic motivations, your salespeople need to eat, they need to live, and they want to make sure that they're compensated fairly. So you need to make sure that you are doing just that. Let's get into a few terms that you're going to see throughout here. The first is this idea of a total target compensation or total target cash compensation. TTCC, that you'll see it abbreviated from place to place. This is basically on target earnings. If someone meets their base quota, how much are they going to make? This is probably what you've been promised if you happen to have applied for a job and they say you're going to make $95,000 in your first year. That's assuming that you make quota. Commission is probably what everyone's heard about, and that is basically a percentage of your sales, profit, or revenue that you're going to get as compensation or earnings. Your quota is an output KPI. Essentially, how many units or revenue or profit did you make for the company? Some companies will go and say that you need to earn a certain amount of profit. Of course, the problem with that is that now you might only focus on high profit products. So they may say you need to earn a certain amount of revenue for the company, or a certain amount of units need to be sold. This is all going to come into play with whatever the company's strategy happens to be. As a sales manager, you may be given specific directives to affect whatever sales are going to happen. We'll sometimes talk about quota distribution. Quota that's too easy might mean that you overpay or under-challenge your sales force. Quota that's too hard means that you might underpay and create problems with your sales force, as we've discussed with the Wells Fargo situation. General assertion is that 2/3 of salespeople should be able to reach or exceed quota. That might look like this. In any sales force, you're going to have your laggards, your stars, and your core. Your core are going to be doing the bulk of the sales and the revenue. You will have some stars, but you're always going to have those laggards. Now, it's important to understand why those laggards are laggards. And sometimes it's because they're disengaged, or sometimes they're not good. Your new people might come in as a laggard, and of course, you're going to build them up to get into that core at the very least. If you're setting your quota right, according to the researchers, 30% may not make that quota. Hopefully, they're still making enough to live. Again, if your quota is set properly, according to the experts, 60% should at least make that particular quota. So whenever you see research saying that a certain percentage of salespeople don't make their quota, that's just the way it's designed to be. When we talk about eligibility, this is just basically thinking about what jobs are eligible for what type of compensation. This might mean what type of buyer or customer contact your salesperson has. Again, if they're an inside order taker, then commission might not be the best bet for them, or at least a strong commission, because they're still only taking those calls in. Also, as I mentioned with the Hershey or M&M Mars situation, their ability to persuade the customer to actually make a purchase should factor into that. Someone working for a CPG such as E&J Gallo can't sit there and make sure that everyone's drinking the wine or taking the wine off the shelf. It's the grocery store that does that. So the compensation is designed accordingly. So we think about the cash but also non-cash components of what you happen to be working with. You'll usually have your base salary, then your variable sales compensation, and that's the commission or bonuses. But you may also have benefits. That would be health insurance, retirement plans, etc. You may also have contests or special program incentive funds. That's a temporary incentive. You could also do various recognition events, giving expense accounts or other reimbursements. Some salespeople get a car, as an example, as well as regional issues. And when we're talking about regional issues, so you might think about the cost to compensate someone in New York City versus the cost to compensate someone in Des Moines, Iowa. It's going to be different. And how you design your regional sales compensation packages are going to vary accordingly. How might this look? So we talk about pay mix and leverage. So in a salary position, pure salary, you would have 100-0. So that's a base salary, 100% with no target incentive amount. In a 90-10, 90% salary, 10% based on commission or bonuses or something along those lines. 75-25, again, 75% salary, 25% target is going to be that commission. Again, someone can work over that, and you'll see that in the next slide. And 0-100 would be pure commission. Let's graph this out. We want to look at upsides and incentive. That means anything over that target cash compensation. So in other words, if someone makes 125% of quota, well, then they're going to be getting upside earnings. One thing about commission that's important to mention, though, is whether you're using accelerators or caps. A cap is a limit on that commission, and an accelerator is a way of getting more commission over quota. Taking a look at accelerators, this might be 10% commission for 100% of quota, 15% for 101 to 125% of quota, and maybe 20% for any sales in that 25% above 100% of quota. So you can see that would incentivize someone to go over their quota and continue to sell. On the flip side, it could also make for a very aggressive salesperson. Remember, extrinsic rewards can ruin intrinsic desires. When it comes to commission caps, I'm generally not a fan of them. Some of the cons, some of the negatives of commission caps is that it essentially can disincentivize certain sales activities. So a salesperson might just say, well, I'm done, I'm not doing anything else. It can also cause something called sandbagging. Sandbagging is when a salesperson will delay the close of a sale to the next quarter or sales cycle so that they can get their commission on it. So in other words, it doesn't actually stop the sale. However, if done right, it can force the salesperson to think about prospecting more often, getting into mentor, or just doing anything to avoid the aggressive sales or territory saturation. When I say territory saturation, it means that they're so aggressive with their sales, if it's geographic territory, maybe they've sold the whole territory way too soon, which can create way too much inconsistency in the salesperson's activities. Graphed out, we see that total cash compensation, total target cash compensation, right there. So we've got base and the target incentive. That's to get the person to their quota. Anything above the base is considered leverage. And of course, anything over what that target would be the upside incentive to sell over. A commission cap gets rid of the upside incentive and may only cap someone at that total target cash compensation. Here's something for you to try to do. Go back and look at the Digital Think case, thinking about the various customers that were there. How would you design a compensation package for that new set of territories? Some other questions for you to consider with that. Beyond that, let's get into some questions, thoughts, and comments. How can upside incentive cause unethical behavior? What could be the issues with a low base? Would there be any issues with a high base? What problems are caused by both low and high quota? What challenges exist when coming up with this pay mix? And overall, what pay mix and internal and external motivators could make for a positive position or job for you? That's all we've got here on Salesforce compensation. If you're watching this on Tuesday, I hope you will have a great Thanksgiving. And if you're watching it afterwards, I hope you had a great Thanksgiving. Look forward to seeing you in class. And take care, Gators. If you're going to the game, go Gators.